Gold on I'd say I've probably given this about 20 different takes because there's a lot that I have to say, not just about Attack on Titan, but specifically about the range of things that go through my mind whenever I'm watching or reading Attack on Titan. This goofy little, this goofy looking Japanese anime. Because for starters, I was never really even that much of a weeb growing up. I mean, as much as I'm fully aware that it doesn't count, but the closest exposure I had to anime as a kid was Avatar The Last Airbender, which is undeniably influenced by anime, regardless of where you think it falls on the anime hierarchy or any of that shit. But Attack on Titan was something different, and funny enough, it was vaguely reminiscent of the first time I watched Lord of the Rings as a kid. The the sort of the I think the word I'm looking for is the depth of Attack on Titan and the relevance. There's almost a timelessness to it that I suppose in a nutshell that's what vaguely reminds me of Lord of the Rings when it comes to Attack on Titan. And I've gone on and on about the show for a couple minutes now. But as I said, it's really something larger than that. It's many things that are much bigger than some formerly obscure Japanese television program. It's over the course of the last 10, maybe 12, 13 years. I'm the kind of guy who likes to go down rabbit holes, and the rabbit holes that I've gone down have become almost disturbingly pertinent to the times we live in. I mean, currently in America, if you have even an iota of interest in the news, you'll understand that there are major political developments all across the Western world, not like we'd know about the Eastern political situations all that well, even if we were all interested in knowing what's happening in China and Russia. Even if we did have the express interest of knowing what's going on over there, we wouldn't be permitted to know. But in the Western world, there's major winds of political change that have been stirring up, and if you're particularly partial to UFO subject matter, there have been extreme developments as far as UFO, UAP disclosure, and I suppose luckily enough for me, from an early age, I was always interested in mythology. I loved fiction. I loved reading fantasy fiction books while I was growing up. I loved movies. I loved the way that stories could be told. That goes for video games as well, especially in this day and age. That goes for video games. But something about Attack on Titan, and I only became hip to it within the last few years due to a buddy of mine's extreme recommendations towards it, especially once he found out that freshman year of high school, I watched the first 5 or 6 episodes, decided it wasn't for me, went back to thinking about football and video games and studying for school. Anyways, the long story short of it is, I came to Attack on Titan relatively late. By the time I got into it, the entire show had been released, and thanks to my dear buddy's insistence that I watch the show, I've found that for the last, I think it's 3 years now, for the last 3 years, I almost think about Attack on Titan daily. And it largely has to do with ufology, politics, human psychology, all the neat little interesting buzzword subjects. The word for it really is the humanities. But as far as storytelling goes, there's a difference between, I find, something that is written and produced and airs as a form of entertainment. There's those stories, the entertaining stories. And then there's also stories that exist on what I'm going to call the operatic level. And on the level of an opera, and granted, I don't mean that in the sense of like, oh, there have to be frilly dresses and ladies with big old titties singing their souls off on stage. That's, the where the term opera is coined from, is that sort of Enlightenment era phase of musical theater. But that's an opera, of course. But when I say an opera, I'm thinking of it more in the way that Star Wars is an opera. I mean, you could even say that Lord of the Rings is an opera in a sense. And I'll get into the details of that later on, but for now, just understand that what I mean by the opera is, or by an opera rather, is I think of an opera as it's a story of an individual character or protagonist that really tells, or the character exemplifies kind of a broader social change at work. Now, of course, there's a lot of fictions that sort of endeavor to give a snapshot of an era or a time period by telling one person's story. And that can be a great way of learning about an era, but I don't think an opera is necessarily a period piece. It's not a historical framing device. Now, of course, I'm coining my own term for a genre, but I think an opera should be a more recognized genre, because what I mean by an opera is it's on a grand scale, it's grappling with a society or a civilizational attitude or a change that's multifaceted, and this one character or protagonist is expressly at the center of what these sweeping changes are. It's This character's got to be multifaceted. They have to have layers to them, and in the way that Star Wars was clearly wasn't a technically science fiction film. It was always recognized more as a space opera because, much to people's surprise, Luke Skywalker turned out to not be a two-dimensional action hero. He wasn't Arnold Schwarzenegger, fighting with some other robot on the way to save the human race from a Skynet or so. It's not simply a social or a political movement that an operatic character is exemplifying. It's something more ideological, almost something existential about it. And I think that's really what the crux of it is in a far more multifaceted sense, Attack on Titan is such an opera. And I'd like to think that I could take these videos to maybe make the case to somebody who isn't all that interested in anime or just is entirely unfamiliar with animes and mangas and the kind of Japanese side of influential Western pop culture. In fact, I would kind of bulk it even calling it pop culture. But if Lord of the Rings can be a pop culture icon, then I certainly would like to think Attack on Titan could. But there's something at work in Attack on Titan, and I do my best not to linger on it when the subject comes up, because God knows I could go on diatribes for days about UFOs and these sort of political winds that have been stirring here in America. But I think why I would rather broach those issues, why I would rather raise my voice to the winds of change that seem to be blustering right now, at least in my country. I think the reason why I would prefer to sort of gradually bring my own voice into that narrative and bring it in through these musings that I've had about Attack on Titan for a while. I would rather I would rather show than tell, despite the fact that I'm telling my takes, I'm telling my views on things. I'm currently working a lot of things out where where all this applies. But the show aspect of Attack on Titan, I think, makes a lot of my cases for me. And I intend to get into the ins and outs of it. But for now, all I'll say is fiction often gets pariahed into this category of entertainment where we equate it with something we do when we have downtime, when we're actively looking to waste our time. We'll consume these various forms of media in order to sort of just eliminate dead space while we're in between things that actually matter. But fiction is a much more powerful tool than something we can just relegate to, the backspaces of our lives. What fiction is at its grandest heights, fiction is it's an inner reflection of the highest degree. When I say that, I'm thinking of mythologies. I'm thinking of the way that a very powerful film or a powerful novel, this isn't something unique to the modern era of, film and Hollywood. This effect that fiction has on us to the degree that something is able to move you. It's relevant. After all, there's many things to worry about. There's a lot of business to attend to during the day to day. People have to eat, people have to pay bills. You got to figure out where you got to go and how you're going to get there. There's a lot to this life, and there's a lot of very difficult circumstances ahead of all of us with these kind of major developments of the world. I've made an effort to not speak too explicitly about the issues I have in mind, but there's world events, there's political changes, there's genuine social animosity around every corner. So it might seem like right now is not really the time to spend dwelling on fictional media. I think C.S. Lewis said it best once in a quote from his book, The Weight of Glory. In this book, Lewis comments on how the human nature is inextricably bound up with not just the stories of mythology, but the stories that are the versions of our lives that we tell ourselves. He says, the insects have chosen a different line. They have sought first the material welfare and security of the hive, and presumably they have their reward. Men are different. They propound mathematical theorems in beleaguered cities, conduct metaphysical arguments in condemned cells, make jokes on scaffolds, discuss the last new poem while advancing to the walls of Quebec, and comb their hair at Thermopylae. This is not panache, it is our nature. And with that being said, I find that there's a lot of entertainment these days. There's a lot of time wasting material that we observe merely to kind of lull us to sleep before we start the next work day. But Attack on Titan is one of those stories. It's one of those modern myths that I think expresses something at the heart, not just, a broad brush human history or, it's not just commentating upon something. It's speaking to and in a lot of ways adding to the development of our inner world that we carry with ourselves throughout the nuts and bolts day-to-day realities. But I've said enough for now. At this point, I'd rather let the show speak for itself for a minute. So with that being said, I invite you, before I sort of delve into the details and quit generalizing about everything I intend to speak on, I want to give you an example of what I mean. Now, this is a combination of visuals and themes and motifs and music. It's a lot of nuts and bolts, but this sequence of Attack on Titan, I would argue that it invites a change. It invites a change in demeanor and a change of heart. There's something to Attack on Titan that I think speaks to the modern soul, especially in the young people that are presently anticipating the inheritance of a world of conflict. And I think that's the best sales pitch I could give to somebody who averse to obscure or eccentric mediums of art and fiction. And with all of that, I invite you to take this in and ask yourself, does this say anything about me? Does this seem like all panache? Or does this speak to a higher nature? Does it move my higher nature in any way? What is the myth that this story is telling?